Welcome to Brooklyn to Beijing, Black People, Black Culture in China. This is the second event in the After the Dragon, Asia's, Africa's, and New York City series. If you missed our first event, a cooking show with Sean Liu from MSG Kitchen and Veronica Peterson, you can check it out on the Harvard Asia Center's YouTube. Our next event, which will be hosted on Zoom, is about Asian street style and will feature Terrence Kim from the brand Issei, Daisy Wong from Dawong, and Dr. Megha Sharma Sedev, an anthropologist studying Muslim women, domestic violence, and textiles. So that event will be on October 9th at 10 a.m. Before we get into the panel, I just wanted to say another huge thank you to Harvard's Asia Center, the Anthropology Department, and the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies for their generous support of this series. A particular thanks to Tenzin Ngorup, Julie Story, Chris Paul, Andrew Zapita, and Mike Holmes for their administrative support. Bohan's a speaker tonight, but I also have to thank him for his help with the sound. And I'm pretty sure the mixer is Zach's, so I think it's been a whole team effort getting this together tonight. And of course, I cannot thank Winton Wong, Brett Ryoji Kodama, and honorable mention Priska Cho for their help with the live stream and tech support. They are doing like an absolutely incredible job with this situation, so we're super lucky to have them. My name is Maya Singhal, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the anthropology department at Harvard. I co-organized this series along with Veronica Peterson, Rowan Fladd, and Michael Pewitt loosely around my dissertation research, which deals with African American and Chinese American mutual aid, crime, and criminalization in New York City. As anthropologists, we often talk about community engagement and public anthropology, but it can be hard to explain what it is that we actually do as anthropologists working and conducting ethnographic research. For me, the practice of ethnography boils down to engaging and talking with people in the places they work or live, which brings us here to BierWax. For those of you joining us online, BierWax is a Black-owned vinyl record and craft beer bar here in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn. And we're super grateful to them for letting us use their backyard for this discussion about Black revolutionaries, hip hop, and Black culture in China. It felt like a very fitting location for these themes. Now it's my honor to introduce our speakers. Zifeng Liu is a historian currently working on a book that explores Black left feminist interactions with Chinese officials and intellectuals during the Cold War. Jamel, down on the end, aka MC Tingbudong, is a hip-hop artist, scholar, and activist who spent years studying and participating in the Beijing hip-hop scene. And he recently released Viral, an EP and multimedia project that explores the relationship between China and Black America. Bohan Phoenix, next to Jamel, was born in China and immigrated to the US at age 11, challenging the mainstream music scenes in both the US and China. Bohan makes music in both Mandarin and English. And Zach, aka Jackery, is an incredible producer and musician. He and Bohan have been making music together for almost 10 years. And they also recently released an album called Cities Are for Fools. And shameless plug, the album release party is at Baby's All Right in Williamsburg this Sunday. So if you don't have tickets already, run and get those online now. All right. So my first question for all of you is, what's your relationship with Chinese hip hop? How'd you get into it? Where'd you come to it from?
Dope. So I'll jump in, I guess, because so thanks for the very spirited introduction, and it's awesome to be up here, and be amongst homies. Yeah, I mean, I think my relationship with Chinese hip hop really began with a bit that I did on an old school YouTube show called Sexy Beijing, where we were in Beijing at Yugonggishan nightclub, and I was there to answer the question I'd always been asking since I first started studying Mandarin in high school, which was, where is the hip hop? And at that night, we were at a Section 6 party. I'm on stage with a shirt that says Tingbudong, right? And I start jumping up and, I'm rapping in English and in Mandarin. And the folks in the crowd, they're like, oh, 我操，他的 T 恤上都说他听不懂，但是他真的能听懂，叫起来 MC 听不懂。他们都给我起了一个名字，内王上。They gave me a name that night. And so that's really where my kind of relationship with Chinese hip hop began officially over there, but it had always kind of been stewing around in my imagination as a student. And I think now we're at a point where you see hip hop, Chinese hip hop, exploding across the country, and there's a real potential for it to go really international. So with that, I'll pass it on.
I've known Tingbudong for a long time. I didn't know that whole story. So, yeah, that was dope.
It was Jolly that gave me that name.
Amazing. So I started performing hip hop in high school around a time when I joined the gospel choir, and for years it was just like imitating, my favorite artists and trying to be like them and trying to have that type of influence. But for years, like after I got to New York in 2010, I didn't think like my music got anywhere. But when I started adding in some Chinese and some of my own stories and life elements, it started to resonate with more people. And I don't think it was until then that I realized, okay, like there might be a thing like Chinese hip hop, but it's not really, at that time, right now I think of Chinese hip hop as just the fact that I'm Chinese and I'm participating in this Black culture art form that is hip hop. But yeah, I think it took me a while to get to this place, but we can get into that later.
Yeah, so basically, I met Bohan for real about 10 years ago. And when I met Bohan, like, he was just a rapper to me, like this whole like Chinese rapper thing didn't really exist in my brain. And I remember using Chinese samples and encouraging him to rap in Chinese just because it was different, and just because I was coming at it from a place of like, just standing out in hip hop is so important, especially in this day and age. And so I just wanted him to stand out, and we kind of ran with it, and it sounded great. And we were able to tour China many times. I think I've been there 5 times, which is a really unique experience for an American, especially a Black American. And so that access has given me, this really interesting, I've seen a lot of really cool stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna pass it on.
All right, thank you. So as someone who only listens to hip hop, and also someone from China, I think my earliest memories of hip hop that I encountered in China probably date back to the early 2000s. At the time, I learned about this person called MC Hot Dog from Taiwan, and he was huge. And then, but also like hip hop at the time had been integrated with the other genres of music. So for like a pop song, there might be like a verse that was sung in hip hop. So, but then in the past several years, hip hop became huge in China, and there was a show called The Rap of China, and out of that show emerged a lot of very famous, successful rappers, and then I feel like now there is really like a hip hop scene in China, and of course there has been censorship and other things, but still I feel like my encounter with hip hop really evolved the development of hip hop in China.
I love that. Thank you. So, Zifeng, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research, because I think it's maybe not necessarily the most obvious connection, but I think that a lot of the themes that you're interested in kind of resonate with these folks too. So.
Oh yes, of course. So I'm writing a book about Black radicals in China during the Cold War, and one of the themes that I'm interested in is really this citation or invocation of Blackness in China. Well, in the book that I'm working on, it's about the Cold War, but still, at the present moment, we can think about the invocation of Blackness in China and what does that invocation do. But in my research, during about the Cold War. So blackness was invoked to kind of construct a kind of cosmopolitan socialist Chinese identity. And also blackness was a part of this understanding of among Chinese people of China in the world. And that understanding really posited a kind of solidarity between black people and China, but also in those expressions of solidarity, there was, of course, hierarchies, and also the Chinese government always imagined itself to be the center of the world, and the Chinese government tried to basically claim its ideological supremacy in many ways. But also at the same time, I'm interested in how black people reach out to China, and also the ways in which black people try to shape perceptions of blackness in China. So one great example would be Shirley Gorman Du Bois, who actually lived not too far from here, and she actually taught African American literature in China, and she really showed people that black people during the Cold War were freedom fighters. They had high aspirations for freedom, and so she and other people really injected this understanding of black radicalism into public discourse in China during the Cold War. I'll just stop here.
Thank you. And Jamel, I feel like a lot of what Zifeng works on kind of resonates with some of your interests about thinking about China and Black America, like in your new album. And I think you also sort of use hip hop to talk a lot about sort of social justice issues and education issues. And I was curious about sort of how being in China or sort of rapping in Chinese kind of ties all of those together for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, as Zifeng, as you were speaking, it was just like really bringing to mind how my experience of both learning Chinese and interacting with Chinese hip hop has been racialized from the jump. So, I mentioned that story with Bling Bling in Beijing and really connecting with the hip hop scene. That was like in 2006 in Beijing. And it was really like seeing kind of like kindred spirits, like people that look like you right up the block or act like your homies right up the block, but they're, from Beijing and have only lived in and been in Beijing. And so it, kind of initially began with that. And then when I returned for the, I later applied for like a Fulbright grant and then received a Fulbright to study and produce a multimedia ethnography on hip hop in Beijing. And that really, I think, was really foundational because I was, spent a year living with, homies from Insar, from, kicking it with folks like Dana from the Iron Mike, who was really pivotal in bringing like hip hop culture and underground battle rap culture to China. And I think that really like laid the basis for that exchange. But all of that almost never happened because I was actually like assaulted by police. And, I'm sitting there thinking that I would be able to call the State Department and say, look, these police jacked me up. You guys should come after them, right? I instead got a call from the State Department saying, hey, your Fulbright grant is in jeopardy. And you actually have to come to us and explain what happened because we heard you got into some trouble with Johnny Law, right? And so the entire experience of it, both of being there, that could have happened. There could have never been an MC Tingbudong because some cop decided to like fucking fuck me and my friends up, right? And so I think that's something that always like animates and motivates me in thinking about both, and really helped me to drive and look at the historical connections even between Black America and China. Besides the day-to-day, and I'm sure, Zach, you might have some to attest to this, and Bohan, you know about this phenomenon too, of like being a Black person in China and, it's raining, people coming up to you seeing if your skin runs in the rain and shit like that, right? Dealing with that kind of thing, but really thinking about this, what are the actual like historic connections between it and what role has China played in the Black imagination? That it really drove me to kind of, to think about and dig into that. And one figure that came up for me really, that became kind of really inspirational for me in the story of it was really Paul Robeson in the song Chilai, and, and that whole connection of, him singing the Chinese national, what became the Chinese national anthem, the March of the Volunteers in Harlem. And so, you know, these are all things that I started to like incorporate and look at in my work and started to like really think about. And, you know, I think, you know, I guess the last thing I'll say on this was seeing the parallel experiences of my homies in Beijing who were actually going through political repression in a similar way that I was, in that black and brown people were, you know, in 2011, 12, 13, 14. I was part of organizing the stop and frisk policy here in New York. You know, homies were seeing that in China, while at the same time, folks like Insar were having their music on ban lists, right, and being targeted by the government, right, dragged out and like, you know, piss tested, and the entire underground community that I became, that I kind of came up in, was being demolished, you know, like right, you know, in real time. And seeing that parallel experience really wanted me to bring that into my work and into my music, and really gave me the push to pursue music actually in the first place, because that wasn't really the direction I was heading in. It was much more of research. But yeah, those are some of the ways that I think, you know, this question of like the connections between Black America and China, what are the historical connections, and how is that rooted in a political and social movement? You know, it really made me investigate those questions.
Yeah, Bohan or Zach, I don't know if you have sort of like share those experiences or have some of the similar thoughts. No.
So the dude that Jamel was talking about, Dana, he was this guy from Detroit, and he went to Beijing in 1999. This is like, I think 4 or 5 years before 8 Mile came out, but he was doing that type of stuff in Beijing with a room full of Chinese people who didn't speak English. So he would be on stage like, all right, so here's the rules, everybody got 45 seconds, and he has somebody right next to him translating in Chinese, and it's like so crazy to watch, because it was like, you know, before social media, it was before everything. But like you said, if I had gone there at that time and I was walking around the venues, I would see people that would dress and act like they were from Bed-Stuy probably, right? So, but they had never been there. So for me, what blows my mind when I see stuff like that, also when we were touring in China, I remember us meeting Higher Brothers for the first time in 2016, and we had never seen any Chinese person with dreads before. And I remember asking dude, you know, we were making a little documentary. I was like, yo, how, you know, what is the full story? And he goes, yeah, I came across hip hop music watching NBA because I loved Allen Iverson. And then through that, I wanted to be like my idol so badly. I learned how to style my clothes. I learned how to do all this stuff, you know? Like, and what blows my mind is the length that they would go, because YouTube and everything is banned in China. They would have to download VPNs, and this is like early days, and they would have to do so much just to get like a right version of a song, or like to find out how to use some sort of stuff in their hair so they can look like that. And like, it was mind blowing. Like at the same time, at that time I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this, you know. But I think for me, so much of that was like the intention was so pure, and they just loved it, you know, like, and yeah. So yeah, I think there's a lot of appreciation there, and that's what fascinates me the most.
Yeah, I remember like the first cat who brought us out on tour was this dude Howie Lee, and I remember like going out there with this attitude of like I'm you know, we're like New York, like we know, like we know all this shit, like we're hip hop, like we're, you know, and I went out there and Howie was just evoking like Sun Ra and like Pharoah Sanders and like all this deep, like radical black art from like the 70s, you know, and like all this stuff that I wasn't hip to. And so it was this moment of like, damn, like how, where did you get this shit from? Like how, so.
He always said like Africa was the future. He always like, and like, you know, yeah.
Yeah, so just like seeing like, just realizing that like there was this line, you know, there that I didn't think existed was really mind blowing. but also makes a lot of sense, especially like, Bohan and I, definitely connected over this like feeling of otherness to a certain extent, like coming from, like a mostly white suburb and also going to NYU, so I think like Black people and Asian people in America have always connected over that feeling too. And then throw in hip hop, which it comes from this like rebellious feeling. Yeah, it all kind of makes sense, but realizing like how deep it is really cool.
Yeah, these stories are amazing. Zifeng, I'm wondering, I mean, you're welcome to add anything, but I was also curious, sort of thinking about, like, sort of their thoughts about sort of Blackness in China and your work. Like, do you see sort of legacies from, like, the Black left women that you write about, or those kinds of, like, theories in today's China?
Thank you. So that is a great question. So the China that we are witnessing now is different from the China that my book is about. So China right now is fully integrated into the global market, and China is expanding its tentacles. So China has a huge presence in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in Latin America. And now, the Chinese economy is slowing down, but China is really trying to basically make money. So in that context, the kind of radical understanding of Blackness, if not completely, at least partially, has given way to a kind of understanding Blackness in the context of global capitalism, and how this kind of a new anti-Black racism really emerged, or perhaps a longer tradition of anti-Black racism in China right now is tinged with this urge to make money in global economy. So in that context, in today's context, we see manifestations of racism in China against Black people, and also manifestations of racism exhibited by overseas Chinese or Chinese immigrants in other parts of the world.
Y'all are welcome to add to that too.
Yeah, I was going to say, Zifeng, you're man. No, I mean, I really agree with the points that you were just raising, and I think we can really see, this actually flows from, and we should ask the question, how did it actually get to be that situation where you actually went from a country that y'all got to think about the 60s. I mean, I'm saying it like I was there. Y'all got to think about the 60s. I wasn't there, right? But from, talking to OGs and reading, about it, China was actually a revolutionary state that was during a time where a third of the world was socialist, right? Where the U.S. was getting its ass kicked by Vietnam, right? And just where there was a whole different way, politically, economically, and socially, that people were actually living. And there was a cultural movement that was flowing from that. That's where that idea of solidarity came from. It wasn't like in the abstract or just, yes, there were personal relationships and friendships that flowed out of that, absolutely, but it wasn't just a matter of vibes, right? It actually depended on, an outlook that people shared in places like the Bandung conference, where they were actually talking about, all right, how do you actually get rid of capitalism, imperialism, and at the time, China was a beacon and a leader of that, right? But what happened, right? That society was actually turned around. It was surrounded on all sides by enemies. It was turned back, and you saw the fall of revolutionary China and the rise of, state-sponsored capitalist China, right? And I think the relationship and the view of Black America in the Chinese imagination has actually, you see that. You see posters in revolutionary China of, of Black, brown, Asian people, right? Ya Fei La, 大到美国大, 帝国, fighting American imperialism, But then you look at, I guess 40 years later, after Rap for China And in this period, and you have like 黑人牙膏, which is like darly black person toothpaste, just still being a thing. This wild racist caricature, of Uncle Tom selling toothpaste, and very, and then this very, viral notions of, black exploitation happening, that was in, I'm not sure if folks have seen the stories that was happening in Africa. But, I think that has to do so much, that cultural, I just think the connection between like the cultural byproducts and how that's the perception of blackness in China, how that's actually shifted is very related to what's actually happened there politically and economically. And, but yeah.
And y'all are also like welcome to just jump in at any time if you have thoughts or questions. And for the audience,
I'm really just learning, listening to Zifeng and Jamel.
yeah, true. I mean, this is just like a wealth of knowledge. For those online in the chat, you're also welcome to put some questions in the Q&A at any point, and we'll try to get to them. I did kind of want to talk, I feel like Jamel and Bohan and Zach, y'all both just, or all three of y'all just sort of dropped projects pretty recently, and I was curious to sort of talk through the process of your album. Maybe I'll start with Bohan. And Zach, you've made a lot of music that kind of incorporates Chinese elements into hip hop, and the album you just released doesn't have as much of that, but I was curious like how your perspective and process and kind of like thinking through those sort of Chinese elements in your music, how that's changed over the years.
Yeah, there's really not much Chinese influence on Cities Are for Fools except for some Chinese verses here and there. There's Push Me. Why is that Chinese? Oh, because there's like people on there? Yeah. No, well, so I think, when me and Zach started making music that involved Chinese, it was really my way of finding confidence. It was really my way of like going to these open mics and doing these shows and then having people perk up, because before I was just trying to come up with impressive punchlines or really, outrageous bars or whatever, but you can't really beat like Lil Wayne. You can't really beat Eminem, and no one is out here saying stuff where I'm like, oh, whoa, so I was really just trying to tell my story, because I realized that's how I got into hip hop was, I was 11 years old. I didn't speak English. My mom had me watching movies to learn English, and I saw 8 Mile, and I saw the power of storytelling and how it transformed someone's life and gave them confidence. So to me, hip hop was that. It was my way of finding confidence. And for a long time, when it didn't resonate, and when I started rapping in Chinese and it did, I was like, oh, I found my sound. And every song I did was half English, half Chinese. It was really my thing, from 2015 to 2018, 19, and we toured China. We did a lot of cool things. And I got blogs, write-ups that I never did before. People were calling it Oriental trap music. And but I was much younger, and I was so hungry for any validation and recognition. I was like, yeah, this is great. Let's run with this. But I think in recent years, I realized there's nothing more Chinese about none of the things that I do. Nothing more Chinese than what I look like and who I am and myself. So instead of further trying to exoticize what I love doing to get some write-ups or whatever, and also at that time I really couldn't make a song that made sense unless you spoke both languages, because halfway through I'm like, oh, I need to switch it up now, And so I think in recent years I'm trying to just go back to the initial goal of just storytelling and just making the music that I want to make. And I think that's why on the new album there's not so much erhus and other stuff. Yeah. You have anything like that?
Yeah, it's that's just freedom, It's by the same it's super dope to sample a bunch of records from Korea, like which we've done, and like, you know, it's also dope to just like make a record of just like soul music and like let's throw in some reggae, like, you know, and like let's throw in some trap, like let's just do what we want, and yeah, just like not feel confined, you know, like that's just like that's the goal. You know, like I just got off tour with like an all black like noise band that I play with. It's like let's do it. Like we shouldn't feel you know, walled in.
Yeah, and a lot of this, like when we're doing it, we never thought about it like this, you know? We never thought about it as like, oh, Chinese hip hop or whatever. We were just like making music and we were trying to do stuff that we haven't heard ourselves, you know? But then like when other people started talking about it, they started putting labels on it, that's when we started like thinking, I'm like, oh, well, maybe there's this, I don't know, whatever, you know?
Yeah. Which is like what happens when when people hear your music, you know, it's just something you have to deal with. But yeah, always just like remembering to just follow your heart.
Jamel, you want to talk us through Viral a little bit? Because it's a super ambitious project, I feel like.
Yo, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I was thinking about that, but then also thinking about, you know, y'all's project that, you know, Cities Are for Fools. I mean, I think, and just even this question around, like, if you're not rapping in Chinese, does that not make you, like, you know, do you suddenly lose that part of who you are? Like, hell no. If the track doesn't have, you know, is every track with drums African? You know, no. You know, it's like culture or sound is not the particular, you know, part of any one property of any one culture or not, right? And we should strive to live in a world where that isn't, where culture isn't owned by people. This is really a thing that's come with the advent of capitalism, imperialism, right? Where like even culture and even fighting oppression becomes the property of people, right? And it's like, you know, I think that's why I do really dig into seeing like your growth and progression as an artist in that, and you know, you hear the influences, you know, in the instrumentation and in some of the verses, but then also, you know, I think this project, for me, it really came across as like a really like classic, almost like, you know, doo-wop original New York City big band sound, you know, and that in fact is actually that's something that, you know, integrates all of who you are. And so for me, it didn't seem as much of a dichotomy, you know. Yeah, I mean, but yeah, in terms of Viral is, you know, I think we've had this conversation around like rapping in English and Mandarin, and it's like, yo, if you switch it up halfway through the song, I really hope my whole audience understands both languages. Because, you know, but the purpose of Viral was really as like a conversation between Black America and China, you know, and thinking about this time where we're all locked up during the pandemic, and suddenly Black America and China are under the crosshairs, right? Where you had, you know, this virus that's coming out of Wuhan, China, right? And, you know, Trump getting on stage and swaggering up and calling it a fucking China virus, right? And then impacting places like New York City, you know, where it hit Black and brown people the most, and you saw just the crosshairs of this system, like really fine tune on you know, Black and brown people, and you know, on our Asian brothers and sisters in places specifically in China. And so Viral really it came as an initial kind of reaction and inspiration to that, but then really grew to become like, you know, a multimedia project, a virtual world, you know, kind of persistent world that like people from all over the globe can participate in. And so you can actually log on to Tingbudong.nyc. It's a 6-track album and experience and visual and musical experience, but you can log on to Tingbudong.nyc and explore it, and explore like a browser-based 3D environment. I hosted a virtual Lunar New Year party, which Bohan was a part of. That was super, super dope, where we had artists from, you know, shout out to Shanghai Community Radio. We had artists from Shanghai. We had my homies Eddie and Kayla, from who are based in Taiwan, you know, and you know, folks like DJ Underdog here from the States, and it was really about like kind of having this cultural bridge between Black America and China, so yeah, that's what, you know, that's the project of Viral. Folks can check it out, and you can listen to the music on Spotify and on Apple Music. but yeah, all the tracks there, and it was really are in English and Mandarin, because it's really about informing Chinese audiences about what was happening here, and informing Black American audiences about what was happening there.
I love it. Okay, well, with the end of our time, I was gonna open up to questions. I don't know if that was a question, Veronica.
Oh, I was saying, did you want to go?
Oh yeah, yeah. So if anyone has questions, feel free. Yeah. Maybe just talk really loud and I'll repeat it.
Okay. So, well, first of all, thank you for this panel. Thank you to the organizers. My training is in anthropology, but I don't work on hip hop. I just love hip hop. And so I really appreciate the panel and sort of all of you sharing your personal testimonies and reflecting on the connections between Black America and China. And I really appreciate the circulations of racial capitalism, as you brought up, Zifeng, and the idea that anti-Blackness circulates globally. And I feel this really deeply as someone who grew up as an ethnic minority in Singapore, where you have the Chinese as an ethnic majority, and I felt the embodied instantiations of anti-Blackness. And so I wonder if we could unpack slightly the term hip hop itself, right? And because I'm like thinking, when I think of hip hop, like I think of a range of like genres, like I think of like Jay-Z, I think of The Last Poets, I think of J. Dilla, I think of Madlib, I think of like different genres, different projects, and I wonder, because I don't know a lot about Chinese hip hop, and so I was wondering if you could expand a bit more, and whether or not, beyond riffing off Black American hip hop genres, Chinese hip hop in China was also addressing anti-Blackness and the circulations of anti-Blackness, and what that looks like, and the performance or the stylized performances of American hip hop. Thank you.
Oh man, that question was super rich, and so I can't even repeat it in a way that would do it justice. But I think that the gist is unpack the term hip hop, especially in relation to Chinese hip hop, and whether Chinese hip hop has sort of addressed the anti-Blackness that we see addressed, I think, in like the sort of, you're implying that we see anti-Blackness addressed in like American hip hop a lot. So how does Chinese hip hop kind of get there, or does it?
Thank you for your question. I think to me, hip hop is a freedom of expression, a form of expression, and that's why it kind of makes sense to see all that range and people's different interpretation of how they can express themselves. And so to me, like hip hop is so, like what it means to me it's probably different to you and to Zach and to you. And so like to me, I think it's really boils down to a way to express myself. And that's why I gravitated towards it when I thought, I had no other way to relate to people when I first got here, right? So your second question, which is a great question about whether or not in China hip hop and the artists behind the genre have addressed various problems that deals with China, hip hop in China. The thing about Chinese hip hop and many things that goes into China is that it becomes extremely commercialized and sterilized of its origins, and it becomes its own Chinese market friendly version, which in today's terms it means you got to look like a K-pop star, because that's kind of what Chinese mainstream pop is ripping off from, is just Japanese pop and K-pop. So there's a lot of people that are, like Zifeng was mentioning the show, that rap of China. There are people that started rapping like a year ago. They went on that show, but because they looked a certain way, and they had a certain amount of chains on, and they were like overnight success, major, like selling 10,000 people like venues, but no, like the show is 2 hours long. Not one time in any episode do they have like, let's have like 10 minutes in the beginning of the episode to explain where hip hop came from, like a little lesson on something, right? So you know, it's really frustrating, and I actually called out like a range of my friends, not called out, I was encouraging people to, you know, donate, and I received a lot of resistance, and a lot of I couldn't understand why they didn't care, and they couldn't understand why I cared so much, and I realized at that point it was just a complete different ideology that we're functioning on, you know. But to the credits of the people that Tingbudong came in contact with in the early 2000s, they were really about it. They have always been vocal, even before social media made Black Lives Matter international thing. They would, you know, you talk to them and they will constantly remind you, like, oh yeah, like Big Daddy Kane, you know, like they will constantly remind and that they're educated and that they appreciate its origin. So those people, the older cats, they definitely have a better knowledge. But yeah, as far as like the artists that are popular on TV today, they're probably not really concerned because China has created its own. You know, you have to be good enough for China, and that's it. You know, you can make so much money in China, you know. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, like, yeah. I mean, as far as like the terminology of hip hop, I think it's generally like it's used. It's mostly just to sell things, you know, like genre and like I'm not like so concerned with like how like anyone defines, like it means different things to different people, and like I think genres in general are just like, you know, capitalist tools. But yeah, like I remember Bo was always like really good about just like, you know, like Bo like got me into Tupac. You know what I mean? Like Bo was always like always trying to keep it real and just always, you know, being like, this is where the shit came from. Like, all right, this is black shit. You know, came from black Americans. But yeah, I mean, like you said, like with the Chinese hip hop show, like it is problematic that they don't just do like a little blurb in the beginning of like this is where hip hop came from. You know, like this came from the Bronx. Like here's some OGs. Like even when I think I just watched like a Beatles or like a Rolling Stones documentary or something, and even they in the beginning they're like, all right, like this came from the blues, the Black Americans, and they do their little like 10-minute spiel, and it's like, you know, it's not enough, but it's still like, all right, like thanks, you know, like it's important.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think absolutely what you're dealing with is like the need for the audience to be informed in that kind of a way, and the fact that China has made it into a completely sanitized commercial product, like on the backs of what originally actually had a lot of that fire and a lot of that fury and a lot of that like, you know, folks were heads. Like my Ijapa from Insar, he's like he got me into like Ragasonic, into reggae every morning. He's like up in the morning blasting Gregory Isaacs, like, you know, really putting me on to shit that, to not just OGs and hip hop, but where hip hop came from. And so there were folks that actually really, really studied it. You know, but now it's a question where it's very prolific, where now it's no longer a question where if you go to China and you say, I'm a rapper, people know what you mean and know what you're talking about. But their understanding of it is like in this very, you know, commercial gold chains way, all right? Not as, you know, kind of storyteller and, you know, an upholder and, you know, voice for the voiceless that's come from, and, you know, that would bring in that kind of responsibility that you're talking about, Bohan, where, you know, where you were very righteously, you know, calling people to the fire about like, hey, this is, you know, you're seeing people around the world rise up and say Black Lives Matter. Why aren't, you know, Chinese artists who have benefited and profited from this, like actually not stepping up and stepping into this? And it was, you know, kind of an open challenge to that. And, you know, there were people that actually stepped up and you know, into that. But it was a real important moment and a real, you know, important thing to do. I just wanted to like, you know, to big up on that. But then also, describe a little bit of this thing, hip hop culture. It was music, but then also a culture beyond that. And especially in the circles that I came up in, it was folks who were rappers, but those are the same folks who were also, part of the skateboarding crews and skateboarding communities, writing graffiti, studying kind of like all the elements. So it was a kind of like classical understanding versus one that's a lot more contemporary and kind of rooted in, materialism.
Sure, yeah. I'll just briefly add a little bit, and also about the kind of mass kind of commercialization of hip hop. But still, I would say, at times, this kind of oppositional logic in hip hop, or the kind of one of the key characteristics of hip hop, which is always about the commentary on social realities. So that has also been kind of erased in China. Mm-hmm. But I think in some kind of underground circles, there are rappers in China who rap in their local dialects. Seeing that sometimes they can express a kind of oppositional consciousness, but still in China the public sphere is highly regulated, and the government actually is co-opting rap, and there are very nationalistic rap songs in China right now. So I guess it's very difficult to retain that logic at this time. Yeah.
Yeah, and lastly, the group Yinsar that Jamel was talking about earlier, they, in early 2000s, they were the rap group that was cussing out the teachers in the songs and calling the government idiots and shit. And they got their whole life wrecked. They shut their whole, they're not allowed to perform. They lost their entire everything, so.
I remember how, not to dwell on Howie Lee, but I remember he would do, his music is instrumental, and I remember his visuals had all this weird, trippy political subtext in it, and I think it was his way of kind of making this statement about capitalism, this anti-capitalist statement, without getting his shows canceled, and still being able to play festivals and make money, so.
Other questions? Yeah.
I'm a friend of Simon's, and I remember us talking about Wu-Tang, and that I think it's just a beautiful connection and a great reflection of this discussion. So if you could just briefly talk about Wu-Tang, the Shaolin, temple, or.
All right, so that was a question about Wu-Tang, yeah.
Yo, my joke is always Wu-Tang's the first Asian rappers. Seriously. Because if I just told people my story, if I was the other day I was like, man, if I didn't tell people that I got into hip-hop, because over the years I've gotten questions why, why are you rapping? You're Chinese, mostly actually from Chinese people. It's why are you rapping? But anyway, so instead of telling people, oh yeah, I got into hip-hop through watching 8 Mile, what if I was like, oh yeah, I came from the town where Wu-Tang Mountain, and I came to China, came to America, and I seen this group called Wu-Tang, and I went to the concert, and it's a bunch of black people, and then so I was like, and so yeah, I mean when I discovered Wu-Tang, I was completely confused, I was, because at first it was the proper way to say is Wudong, so I was like, is this something else? I wasn't sure. And I was just listening to all these samples and stuff, and then I ended up having to go watch the movies that they were referencing. Yeah. That was the dopest part. Yeah. Was that I didn't see 36 Chambers, I didn't see any of this movie until I found Wu-Tang, and then they educated me, So yeah, so good question.
Okay, great. I'll just say a few words. To use the Chinese phrase, to throw a break, to introduce a jade. So you'll be the jade. I'll just say something simple. So there, of course, is a kind of Afro-Asian connection in the form of references to Kung Fu. Bruce Lee was this icon of kind of Afro-Asian radicalism, right? And a lot of people, especially those active in the Asian American movement in the 1970s, so Bruce Lee was a great icon, a role model for them, because Bruce Lee fought white supremacists, and Bruce Lee worked with the black people. But also around that same time, there was this wave of blaxploitation films, and all those films also drew heavily from Chinese culture. So, and I think many of the artists right now are still drawing on that tradition, and it's a great tradition because it's a resistant tradition. It's a tradition grounded in anti-imperialism.
Bars. No, I mean, Bruce Lee, Jesse Glover, Bruce Lee's first student, right, was, a black man in, I guess this was in Seattle, but wanted to learn martial arts as a form of protecting himself against police brutality, Bruce Lee, Hakeem Olajuwon, Game of Death, right? And their connections, they were longtime friends, and then Bruce Lee teaching Hakeem Olajuwon, you see this like 7-foot dude, but move like a fucking swan. This connection over Wu-Tang, I think this is, amazing. I in 2008 had a chance to like bring or be part of the crew or folks that were like bringing Ghostface over to perform in China for the first time. And so, you had people with like fucking Wu-Tang tattoos coming up. China has a lot of love for like the Wu-Tang Clan, and Chinese hip hop heads have a lot of extreme amounts of love for the Wu-Tang Clan and any of their kind of representatives because of what they actually uphold, them really championing, kind of that like Asian identity, in rap, and even kind of providing a bit of a home, for that. But then, I think it's representative of a whole kind of connection, as Zifeng was alluding to too, of like early breakdancing crews and how they model themselves after wuxia, and how these wuxia films were in the hoods in the 70s, and that's where like black and brown kids who were breakdancing in the parks, what they went to go do, and they're like, smoking weed and throwing beer bottles at it, but like knowing, in the movie theaters, and then going back home and adopting those personas. And so it was this real kind of, this thing of like culture not being regulated to any one, person. It's a great example of like cultural diffusion and it going back and forth. But yeah, if someone was writing a book about, Chinese hip hop, which I suggest this illustrious panel does, there would be an opening chapter on the Wu-Tang Clan and like what it represents, both actually, and as artists, but then also like kind of metaphorically in this connection of it being back an Afro-Asian connection.
You know what I always think of, which is like kind of a left turn, but not really, is like what was the actual relationship between like them and the Asian people in their community at the time? Like, and I can't answer that question, but I always think about like the Wu-Tang Clan is obviously this like example of like this, it's just like love, you know what I mean? It's like this beautiful, just cross-cultural thing. But then there's that like skit on the score.
Oh, yeah.
That always comes to mind, and I'm just like, was
But
this?
that's not them, though.
The Fugees.
Yeah, that's the Fugees, but that's their contemporaries, And it's like, was that more the reality? Like,
Y'all know? Who knows what we're talking about? The skit on the score, the Fuji album. Yeah, like basically on this legendary album, right? The score by the Fugees.
one of the best.
Oh my God.
Probably my favorite hip hop album of all time.
And
not to
in the
use
middle
phrase
of this
hip-hop.
album is just a skit of like these like black people going into a Chinese restaurant in the hood and they're cussing the Chinese dude out. The Chinese dude's cussing them out, and then they like get into some fight, and it was like just like I was
And
so
like there's all these bad horrible accents, and it's just like mockery, and it's.
Oh man, I was so confused. I still am. I have no idea.
So like, yeah.
But I think that is the reality, though.
Yeah,
Like,
there's still a tension,
so much.
Like
I'll
there's
be
still a lot
honest.
of work to do. Like
When I really, I moved to America when I was 11, and I go back and forth every year to see my family. All my family's in China except my mom. And so, I got into hip hop, like I just dove my head in, and I never thought about anything else. And it wasn't until the last 2 years, when George Floyd was murdered, and when all the hate crimes in the Asian community started happening, that I started, like doing research into the history of things. Because the whole time I'm just hanging out with Zach, and I'm like, there's no hate here, you know. But you know, obviously,
Also you, no.
obviously, like I was aware of a lot of the anti-black sentiments in the Asian community, you know. But it was around that COVID time when my friend sent me a screenshot of, you know, of the clubhouse rooms where it's like a room of like 500 black people saying how we shouldn't help the racist Chinese, and I was like, damn, I didn't know that whole side. I was so willingly, you know, like isolating myself around people who were just doing music with me. That yeah, so it's like Zach said, there's so much to learn, and the more I learned, like even today, learning from Zifeng, learning from having Jamel compare the oppression in China that, you know, the people were feeling from the government, and, you know, the black community here feeling from the police. I was like, oh, wow, I never even thought about like that parallel, you know, and yeah, so much to learn.
All right, so we are basically out of time. I don't know if this is like the best place to end it though, because I feel like we're just really starting to get into some deep topics. And like,
I was trying to get into shit earlier. You guys.
yeah, you know, I guess we'll just have to come back, and we are back again October 19th. So y'all should join us on Zoom for that one. And then we got another panel November 9th at You and Me Books in Chinatown. That's sort of picking up some of these topics. It's called Afro-Asia Beats. We're going to be talking about Black and Asian sound and dance cultures. So, you know, we're all still in the mix here talking about this stuff. So thank you so much for coming today. Thank you to our speakers. This was amazing, and I really appreciate learning from all y'all.
Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Maya. Good job, Maya. All right, let's go inside.